Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hey, thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted that you're here. Want to thank you not only for taking your valuable time to spend with the Detroit Regional Chamber, but thank you for your interest in public policy, especially data-driven public policy. I need to thank our chamber team. They've been kind of on a rinse and repeat on this event. They just finished doing this event at the DAC last night, and here we are early in the morning, and they're doing it again. The Detroit Regional Chamber, we pride ourselves on being very data-driven in all sorts of ways. And when we think about being data-driven, especially when it comes to public policy, there is an incredible link in being able to understand what our fellow Michiganders are thinking, what they're feeling, what their opinions are, because as an entity that is, has the charge of impacting public policy, there's really no effective way to impact public policy if you don't know what the public is thinking. And because of that, we have been so very fortunate to partner with our friend Richard Schuba of the Glenn Gariff Group. Richard is the president, but more importantly, the founder of the Glenn Gariff Group, named after his family heritage town in Ireland. We didn't get to that last night. And he founded the firm in 1988 after a distinguished career in Republican politics, including working for the Reagan campaign, working for not only the Engler campaign, but working for Governor Engler when he served as this state's chief executive. Richard is not just our pollster, which obviously we're very proud. He's also the pollster for WDIV Channel 4 in the Detroit News and the Business Leaders for Michigan, along with many, many other clients. He is considered, without a doubt, Michigan's premier pollster because it's accurate, it's right down the middle, and he doesn't play favorites. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Schuba.
I start all of these conversations by reminding people of one thing. Nothing you are seeing this year is normal. Not a darn thing. And let me go through a list of some things. We started this year with 2 presidents running against each other. First time in our lifetimes, only the second time in American history that 2 presidents are running against each other. We have a candidate who was found guilty of 34 felony counts, running for president, first time in our history. We had another candidate, early debate in June, who had the most epically disastrous debate performance this nation has ever seen, frankly. We had not 1, but 2 assassination attempts. We had a candidate who had the votes pull out a month before their convention. Never had that. The vice president secured the nomination within hours, creating what is essentially America's first snap election. All this happens while we have a hurricane roaring through 2 of our swing states and a war raging in the Middle East and one raging in the Ukraine. And I like to joke that 50 years from now, there is going to be some poor kid in high school taking a history exam, and all of this shows up on a multiple choice test, and he's like, there's no way that could all have happened in 1 year. So that is a reminder that nothing you're seeing right now is normal. Let me talk a minute about polling and how you should look at polling this time around. I mean, I'm not naive. I know all anybody cares about is who's winning, who's losing, the ballot test, the head-to-head. But if that's all you're looking at in a poll, you're misusing polling. Because polling helps you understand the chessboard of politics. Not just what decision they're making, but how they're making the decision. What's driving those decisions? And as I like to say, polls tell a story if you're willing to listen to it. And if all you do is look at the ballot test, you've read the first line of the book and said you read the book. So let's talk about the election, what we're seeing right now. Let me give you a rundown of where we started this year. We started with our benchmarking survey in January. And at that point, we had Trump and Biden. And as I said, we had two presidents running against each other. So for the first time I can recall, I was able to do a survey where both candidates, we asked about what we call the reelect question. Does this person, should they be reelected, or is it time to give someone else a chance to do better? Never got to do that before. It was unique. The way we look at that reelect number is if it's under 50, shows some weakness. In this environment, I tend to think if you're under 44, it shows weakness. Donald Trump's reelect at the start of the year was 32%. You're like, wow, until you look at Joe Biden's. Joe Biden's reelect this year started at 17. And his reelect with independent voters, and let me just say, in Michigan, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, I'm sorry to tell you, you don't really matter. The only thing that matters in Michigan are independent voters. And there's roughly 15 to 20%, and they make all the decisions in this state. Amongst independents, Joe Biden's reelect was 7 to 83. I gasped when I saw that number. In 40 years, there's not much I gasp about in numbers anymore. I couldn't figure out back in January, I knew they were seeing these numbers, how they were going to maneuver those numbers. So we had Trump leading originally by 8 points. By June, just before the debate, Biden narrowed that to 2 points, but he was never ahead, which frankly in Michigan is unique, that a Democrat isn't even at least. So then, at the end of July, we were scheduled to go in with the Detroit News WDIV on a Monday morning to start a poll. The afternoon before, Joe Biden dropped out. Being the good Polish kid I am, expecting doom around every corner, I had 2 surveys written, ready to go. And it turned out that that's exactly what needed to happen. That survey, Harris closed the gap to even. By the end of the conventions, we had Trump up 1. Here, after the debates at the end of September, early October, we had Harris up by just over 2. All of that is to tell you, this is a dead even race. This is a pure toss-up in Michigan right now. And whether you see a poll that has Trump up 2 or Harris up 2, with the margin of error, it means the race is dead even. So the word we should be paying attention to this election is margins, because that's what's going to decide the race in Michigan, are the margins that each candidate gets with their base of voters. And that's what this election, that's what these campaigns are doing right now. Let's talk about gender, because when you talk about margins, this is the most genderized election of our lifetime. And you know, I'm dating myself here, but my first campaign that I ever worked on as an employee was in 1984, and Ronald Reagan had this famous gender gap. That gender gap was 4 points. It's quaint now. I mean, I almost laugh when I hear about that. Right now, Donald Trump has a gender gap with women in Michigan of over 12 points. Vice President Harris has a gender gap with men of about 11 points. That's how polarized the genders are. So everything you're seeing right now are these campaigns trying to bolster their bases and cut into those margins. That's why you're seeing the Trump campaign work so aggressively to try and win over non-college black men, because they see a softness there for Vice President Harris. That's why you're seeing Vice President Harris working so hard specifically on non-college white women, that's why she and Liz Cheney were in Oakland County yesterday, trying to secure more of those non-college white women. This election, I like to compare it to a Jenga game. That game kids play where you pull out the pieces, because any little wrong move brings the whole house down on somebody. And at the end of this election, everybody is going to take the blame or credit for a loss or defeat. because everything matters. Every pocket of voters is going to matter here. So when we talk about margins, we've got to talk about turnout operations, because this is where the investment in turnout matters. And we're going to find out who has a good turnout operation on Election Day, but I'll tell you one thing. If I were a Republican operative right now, I'd be banging my head against that wall, wondering why my candidate is telling voters they shouldn't vote by absentee ballot. Because in our polling right now, Harris has more than a 40-point lead amongst likely absentee voters. These are the easiest votes to secure. Republicans should, there was a day where Republicans clobbered Democrats amongst absentee ballot voters because they had such a good operation. It's not the case anymore, which puts all the onus on the Republicans to turn out their vote in essentially a 13-hour window. Yes, you'll have some voting early, but it's that 13-hour window they're counting on now. I think the most interesting numbers I've done this election, we asked the question, what is most important to you in selecting a presidential candidate? Their character and morals, or their policy positions? 47% said policy positions, 39% said character and morals, and 12% said both are equally important. If you in any way said character and morals in your equation, Harris is winning those voters 70-23. If you said policy was the sole basis, Trump is winning those voters 65-24. It's a really interesting difference here. So I said early on that good polls tell a story. So what's the story we're seeing in the polling right now in Michigan? I think the story we're hearing is those things that used to unite Michiganders are now being used to divide Michiganders. And specifically on education, on economic opportunity, and on democracy, we are being divided in this state. So let me tell you 3 stories that we're seeing in the numbers. First, on education. So we asked the question, is a 4-year degree worth the money? 22% said it's worth the money, 52% said it's not. Another 23% said it depends on the degree, which is fair. But 39% of Democrats said it wasn't worth the money compared to 64% of Republicans. This was a state where it used to be widely believed that education was the route upwards. We did another survey, and frankly, one of the more interesting surveys we've done in a while, with parents of high school students. And we asked them what their child was likely to do. 53% said their child is likely to go to college. But 46% of those parents hoped their child would go to college. So there's, right there, 7-point difference between what they thought their child was going to do, what they hoped their child was going to do. But the real shock in that poll is we asked, does your child have an interest in going to college? And that number was 73%. So 73% of their kids have an interest in going to college, but only 46% of those parents hope their children go to college. There's an enormous difference there. And we saw this, in rural parents. 29% of rural parents hope their children go to college. 62% of their kids are interested, though. For parents who have skilled trade certificates, 16% hope their children go to college, but 58% of their kids are interested. So we're seeing a situation where we question the value of education in a world increasingly reliant on you having that education. And parents' beliefs are actually holding their kids back from what they want to do. Second story, the economy of the next generation. We asked, is Michigan prepared to compete in the economy of the next generation? 38% say yes, 47% said no, 15% just not sure. Who says we're not prepared the most? Republican voters at 70%. Non-college voters, 51%. Rural voters, 53%. Outstate voters at 51%. So we asked what I call the $64,000 question. 80% of new jobs in Michigan that make over $64,000 require 4 years of education after high school. We asked these non-college voters, would you be interested in additional education or training to get those jobs? By a margin of 39 to 54, they said no. Now I want to caution and be fair. Age was a major component here. We find that if you can get them by 30, that's when they're really interested. But once they have families and they're settling in, it's hard to get them back into education. But it was 46% of Democrats were interested compared to only 26% of Republicans. In urban areas, it was 52 to 48. But in rural areas, it was 14 to 76. Huge difference. Third part of this, should Michigan aggressively compete to be the center of EV manufacturing? By a margin of 50 to 45, they said yes. But think about that. We are the epicenter, the very epicenter of the auto industry, and we're split on this question. In Metro Detroit, it's 62 to 35, but in rural outstate areas, it's 40 to 54. 72% of Republican voters say we should not compete to be the center of EV manufacturing. 66% of rural voters. So to sum those things up, they say we're not prepared for the economy of the next generation. But the people most likely to say we're not prepared are also the ones telling us they're not willing to get more education to fit into that economy, and they don't want the EV jobs that come with that economy. We got some trouble. Third story I want to tell is on democracy. 68% of Michigan voters are dissatisfied with democracy. 68%. So we asked them a question. We gave them 3 different options and asked them to choose one. Democracy is the best form of government. 67% chose that answer. I'm just going to stop there and let you think about that. 1 in 3 Michigan voters were not willing to say democracy is the best form of government. 17% chose the statement, really doesn't matter if our government is democratic or not. 5% agreed with the statement, autocracy can be preferable to democracy. And then 11% didn't know. Again, a third of voters. That should terrify us. A couple of weeks ago, we released numbers with Governor Engler and Governor Blanchard. And it was as surreal as you would think to have these 2 men who for so long have fought against each other on the policy front, sitting next to each other, defending Michigan's democratic voting system. But that's where we're at. And so we asked voters, are you confident or not confident about the results of the November election and its fairness? By a margin of 77 to 18, they're confident. And you may think, oh, that's great. That's 1 in 5 Michigan voters who lack confidence in November. 36% of Republicans lack confidence. That's over 1 in 3 Republican voters. We asked them, do you trust your local elections to be fair and accurate? 30% of Republican voters don't trust their own local elections. And I thought, oh, well, maybe it's they're living in democratic areas, they're urban areas. That wasn't the case. It was the same number across urban, suburban, and rural areas for Republicans. 23% of Republicans don't trust their own Republican clerks. 90% of Democrats trust their Democratic clerks. So we read them 12 different policy actions that clerks could take. And after each one said, would that increase or decrease your confidence in the November election? And it was real basic things like showing an ID, testing voting machines. all 12 increased confidence by more than 75%. So then we asked after each one, is that the current policy or not? Voters only thought 2 of them were the current policy. And that was the 2 I mentioned. Requiring your ID, only 62% thought that was policy, even though everybody's required to show their ID when they go in to vote in person. And then 56% said testing voting machines before the elections. We asked at the end, if all 12 of those were the policy, would it increase your confidence, decrease your confidence? No. All those people who started the survey unconfident moved to 88%. If those 12 things were all policy. Here's the kicker. All 12 were the policy. But voters don't know it. And they don't know it because they've never had to know it. Because nobody has ever questioned confidence in our voting systems in this state. And that's the erosion we're seeing. We're having democracy turned against us right now. So let me just close with saying, we're never going to agree on policy. You know, we're always going to have these fights, these battles. That's good. That's part of democracy. That's what this is. But we're divided over what our goals are, what's important. You know, states that are doing well right now aren't fighting over whether education is worth it. 4-year degrees are worth it. They are pushing, you look at a state like Massachusetts, they are pushing their kids through higher education to prepare them. Electric vehicles and manufacturing. You can disagree about whether they're good or bad, but this is Michigan. And if a car is being built, it should be built in Michigan. And I guarantee you, this is a conversation that's only taking place here in Michigan. In Georgia, in North Carolina, in Kentucky, in Tennessee, those governors aren't saying, oh, no, we don't want battery plants. We don't want EV manufacturing. They will swipe them from Michigan in a heartbeat. So we need to be very serious about the fact that if they don't come here, they're going somewhere else. And finally, on democracy, I was asked the questions, have you ever asked these questions before? And it dawned on me, I never asked the questions because I never needed to. Because nobody ever thought to challenge the integrity of our voting system because it undermines it. So let me conclude by saying those things that united us, education, economic opportunity, democracy, they're now being thrown against us. They're now being used against us to divide us. And Michigan has a serious question ahead of itself. How do we get past this? How do we start agreeing on what's important to us again? And I think that's the challenge we face at a state, because there's a lot of states that are united on these goals. And we're divided right now. So, Sandy?
Great. Richard, thank you. That was terrific. All right, so much to cover here. All right, let's start. I'm going to start with the candidates, the people that we all know. You started with this really stunning, the re-elect number for Joe Biden at 17%. What are your numbers saying about Vice President Harris's, that's obviously not a re-elect number, but approval versus disapproval? Where is she right now in Michigan?
Well, that would be what we call the favorable, unfavorable. View them favorably or unfavorably. And when she started this, she was underwater by about, I'd say, 17 points. And underwater means her unfavorable was higher than her favorable. She closed that drastically now. She's about 3 points underwater from what I can see, which in this environment, I gotta tell you, 3 points underwater, you should be happy as a clam right now. Donald Trump's, by comparison, he is always the same. His numbers are consistently in that 42 to 55 range. And the problem he has is independents in Michigan, those people who decide this, really dislike him. They seriously have a problem with the way he behaves, and yet they're so concerned about the economy that they're willing to consider somebody they really don't like because they think he's better on the economy right now.
And one of the questions that we ask, we don't necessarily publicize it very much, but we also ask, how's our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, doing? And pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is. We consistently see Governor Whitmer with a job approval in the range of 55. She's gotten as high as 60. And I got to tell you, in this environment, this is rarefied air. It's not often you see a Michigan governor with job approval this high. And when you look at why, first of all, she has a coalition so strong of female voters. I got news for Republican men. There's a lot more women voting than men. You've got to appeal to women. You have to figure out a way. But secondly is those independents. Her job approval amongst independents in Michigan, specifically Southeast Michigan independents, is well over 60%, close to the mid-60s. I mean, it's pretty astonishing. They like her. They see her as tough. They see her as gritty. And, I think it's going to be a long time before we see another governor with numbers like these.
You mentioned the disconnect. I'm sorry, you mentioned the concerns about the economy, and obviously we all hear that. You see it on the news, people are concerned about the economy, but they're not concerned about their own economic situation. So this is something that, we've been asking you to poll on for almost 3 years now. So talk to us about what you're seeing, this long-term disconnect between what people feel about their own situations versus what they view about the economy in general.
Sure. So one of the questions we ask is, thinking about the last year, and before we were doing it, thinking about before COVID, but COVID is now 4 years gone, so we move it to the last year. Has your economic situation improved, gotten better, gotten worse, or stayed the same? About 62% of voters say it's stayed the same or gotten better. About 37 say it's gotten worse. And those 37, largely disproportionately Republican voters right now. But we then ask about inflation and the direction of the economy. Is the economy growing or weakening? Disproportionately, voters say it's weakening. In the May survey we did, we asked voters what the inflation rate was over the past year. And it was less than 1 in 4 said it was under 4%. 37% said it was over 6%. And so it dawned on me, we've had this conversation. If you're of a certain age and lived through the 70s, you know what double-digit inflation was, and you can deal with inflation. But there's a whole cohort that's a lot younger than me that has no idea what inflation was. And they're dealing with it for the first time. And so we are seeing these lingering concerns about inflation and specifically about the cost of food. Increasingly in Michigan, the cost of housing is a big factor here. So there's this disconnect with how they're feeling personally and what they're seeing out there, and frankly, what they're hearing. Because based on whatever source of media you're following, you're either hearing things are okay and improving, or everything's collapsed and it's gone to hell. And those sources of media are absolutely driving perceptions.
So I'm going to follow up with 2 questions here. So number one, the old adage used to be that how you felt about the sitting president was largely determined by how the economy was doing, right? And one of the famous examples, and you remember it well, 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush is running for re-election. The last 6 months of that year before the election, the economy was actually doing relatively well, but the people didn't feel it. So they soured on then President Bush in a really significant way. Lost that election very, very badly. Is that still the rule today? Or has the rule flipped?
The rule has changed. I mean, economy really does matter. I mean, people, their perceptions of the economy matters greatly. But one of the things we see in focus groups, specifically, when we talk to voters about the economy, it's based on whatever party you align with, you find an off-ramp in the conversation. You blame the other side. So that's why you're seeing right now Democrats saying the economy is great, Republicans saying it's terrible. So's independents. And this is the concern for the Harris campaign. Those independents really view the economy as not strong right now because of prices. They're still paying higher prices. But now we have other issues that are overriding this. The issues that really are mattering besides the economy are abortion. Really strong motivating issue, specifically for women. The border is a particularly effective message for Republicans. And then the new issue that has emerged, frankly, out of nowhere is this idea of protecting democracy. That has, particularly with older voters, that's something they care about because they see lots of threats occurring with democracy right now.
So when we originally asked you to start polling around this democracy question, right? Because we kind of all realized that, wow, this is now becoming an issue. I mean, we're starting to see real, tangible threats to democracy. I really had to caution the team. It's like, okay, we're going to see some big numbers, and we did, right? Percentage of people, 67% of Michiganders, if I remember correctly, said that they are concerned about democracy. But each side of the aisle feels it equally. It's not like, just one side. It's not like the Democrats are saying that, okay, I'm concerned about democracy because of the Republicans. The Republicans feel the exact same way about the Democrats, right? So, talk to us more about this whole democracy issue. The concern for democracy is a both-party issue.
Yeah, it sure is. So one of the questions on that poll we asked a couple of weeks ago was, how concerned are you about political violence? And it was in the mid-80s. 51% of Michigan residents think political violence after November is a serious threat. Not just a threat, but a serious one. And it's one of the few bipartisan issues out there right now, is concern about political violence. And when we ask people, why are you dissatisfied with democracy? Why are you concerned about these threats? They do this. It's the other side. It's always the other side that's doing it. And, you talk to Democrats and they say it's Donald Trump ginning up this. It's January 6th. Independents also are concerned about January 6th. But for Republicans, they think the threats to democracy are coming at the voting booth, particularly, the election 2020 was stolen. Our friend Devin Scallion is retiring, unfortunately, and one of the things he prides himself on was he never had an election denier on Flashpoint. And I think that's a route we need to take, that even if we're neutral and we're bipartisan, we cannot accept lies.
Right.
And in this case, we cannot accept the lie that votes are being stolen, because they are not.
Let's talk about the parties and what I call the party switcheroo. So why is it and how is it that Democrats are now Republicans and Republicans are now Democrats? I mean, this has happened very much in my lifetime, and it has happened right in front of my very eyes.
Yep. And it happened in front of our eyes when we didn't even know it was happening.
Yeah.
2016 was the epicenter, the fomenting of the educational switch of party alignment. It used to be that Republicans were largely college-educated voters. Democrats were non-college voters. That's flipped. That has absolutely flipped. Donald Trump has really accelerated that switch. So what we see is both parties now grappling somewhere in the middle, because at some point for Democrats, they're going to have to deal with the fact that their union supporters, a lot of those union members have now moved to the Republican side. And how do their policies align? It's going to be an interesting question. And the same for Republicans. You know, Republicans, when they pass right-to-work legislation here, well, a lot of your supporters now don't agree with that. And you're seeing this play out a lot in the unions. And I think that's why you're seeing such an aggressive push by the Harris campaign right now to keep that union support. Frankly, that's where one of the great battles of this campaign is taking place, is amongst union voters. And we see even splits amongst the unions now. The public sector employee unions, far more democratic. The trade unions, dominated by men, non-college men, are largely moving to the Republican side. I'm going to be fascinated to see how that plays out in the next 10 years.
So, and part of the switcheroo, and I've been talking about this at the chagrin of many, especially in the Republican side of the legislature, that I continually say that the business community no longer has a political party to go to. The days of when, kind of the Main Street Republicans were part and parcel of the business community, that's gone.
Yes, it is. Unfortunately, it is. And I think the business community does not have a natural party right now, natural supporters. There are elements in both parties that you can still turn to. But I think the EV conversation is the perfect conversation here to bring this up. Our big three, which helped build this state, helped build the middle class in this state, they've got to transition. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, well, I'm not going to buy an EV. They shouldn't make the EVs. Well, the big three are not selling EVs, are not selling cars just to Michigan. They're selling cars around the world, and they've got to be competitive. And yet it is the party who once supported business the most who is pounding them the hardest about the transition. I mean, that's the perfect illustration here of you don't have a home if you're in the business community anymore.
Right, no. Sticking with the disconnect, black voters, very interesting.
Yeah.
At least I find it interesting. You might not find it interesting. So when Richard Nixon ran for president successfully the first time in '68, he got 15% of the black American vote. That's exactly what Donald Trump seems to be on track for. We haven't seen a Republican president get double digits. John McCain got 4%. Right. Mitt Romney got 6%. What's happening there in terms of, that's not quite a switcheroo, but it's definitely it is a shift.
So we're seeing in the polling that Donald Trump is gaining specifically amongst non-college black men. And this is part of that educational realignment here. I'll be curious to see what the final number is going to be. I'm suspect that it's going to be that high. But, this always gets me in trouble when I say it. I'll say it again, because I like to get in trouble sometimes. Misogyny and racism are bipartisan issues.
Still there. Yeah.
They are there. People who would have never, ever considered voting for Donald Trump are now considering voting for him because they can't bring themselves to vote for a woman, let alone a black one. We have to accept that that's part of the conversation here. Otherwise, we're just closing our eyes to it. At the same time, there's also a piece of this to the non-college, the realignment that's taking place. The Trump campaign has smelled the weakness. They're really good at smelling weakness. That's their strength, by the way, and they've gone in. But in politics, every yin has a yang. And what you're seeing is the yang to that is women. And you're seeing specifically, that event yesterday in Oakland County with Liz Cheney and Vice President Harris, that was the opposite to this, where they are going in heavy. Just looking at the math, politics is a math equation. It's really hard to win Michigan if you're losing Oakland County big and Kent County over in Grand Rapids. If you can't do better in those counties, I don't see the math in rural areas for Donald Trump. I'm surprised he's not spending more time in Oakland and Kent right now.
So let's stay on the point of the horse race. I know it's not real math, but it's fun, right? So I mentioned this to you last night, and you corrected me, so I'm going to give you a chance to correct me again in public.
Uh-oh.
So the way I looked at it, up until you corrected me, was that at this point in the campaign in 2016, Hillary Clinton was ahead by, close to double digits, right? And then, yep, I know what's coming. I'm going to finish. And Biden, at this point in the campaign, was ahead in low double digits, like 11, 12%. And then I think what Hillary Clinton won, again, this is just popular vote, by about 3%, when the final vote was tallied, and Biden won by about 4 or 5%, right? So based on that math, why would we be confident, if you're a Harris supporter, that she can win?
First of all, that math was wrong.
There you go.
2016, as a pollster, trust me, I have never been happier to not do a public poll in my life in the last 4 weeks of 2016. The polls were wrong because nobody understood the shift in the realignment that was happening. And we weren't paying attention to education levels as a percentage of the respondents. Typically, we are in, you get college educated, much more willing to respond to polls, frankly. And so you have to weight them back and increase those non-college voters. 2016, polls had it wrong. 2020, still not right. Most of us have corrected it. We are now running college educated about 41, 42% in the state of Michigan. That's why the numbers, I think, have a far more representative reflection of what's going on right now. We did this in 2022, where we had that reflection, and we hit the numbers right on the head. And I got to say, of all the years I've polled, 22 was the hardest, because there were a whole lot of pollsters out there saying that the governor's race was dead even, and we were saying, no, she's leading by double digits.
Yeah. And you were right. You were the most accurate.
You take a lot of beating out there for being out there on your own. Right now, we have Harris with just that slight lead in Michigan. But again, it is margin of error. It can go either way. It is that close, and it's going to fall on turnout. So if you are a Trump in the Trump campaign, you are ginning up those rural voters like there's no tomorrow. His softness is suburban areas. They need to do better in suburban areas. If you are the Harris campaign, you are working like hell to turn out women and white college men. Race is very close amongst them. Trump's lead amongst men is with non-college men, but those white college men are very close right now. So those are kind of the fissure points right now in the election.
So let's switch to some of the other races. We have a whole slew of really interesting races in Michigan. So let's start with Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers. What are you seeing there?
So we have Slotkin in our latest numbers up by about 3.5. That may shift in the next week as we do our next round of polling.
And that's a narrowing number, it seems.
Well, it narrowed from, we had it at, had her up by about 7.5, 8 at the end of August. But remember, Mike Rogers just came off of a primary election. He had to spend the month of September consolidating Republicans. This is why it's so darn hard if you have a contested primary to win in Michigan, because you have so little time after August to run a campaign. But he's done a good job of consolidating his Republican vote. That's why it's closer. Frankly, the Senate race looks like a classic Michigan Senate race. Democrats have a narrow, slight lead in Alyssa Slotkin. You know, we released numbers yesterday in CD10, and one of the shocking numbers in that poll was that Alyssa Slotkin is winning that district by 5 points. And why that's shocking is because Harris is losing it by 3. Marlinga is down very narrowly by 3.5. Slotkin winning 5. She is destroying Rogers amongst non-college white women. And I say that focus, and she's doing something right with that group. And I think it's abortion. Abortion is what's really galvanizing those voters because she's made it such a big issue. So I think that race for Mike Rogers, his path is to cling to Donald Trump and hope Donald Trump wins Michigan. That's the way he gets across the finish line, and he can get across the finish line. Don't make any mistake that just because Slotkin is up, for example, she can't lose. She can absolutely lose this state. So you have to keep an eye on that race.
Any chance that Michigan goes for the Democratic presidential candidate and the Republican Senate candidate, or vice versa?
No.
Or it'll be a sweep either way?
No, I don't think it'll be a sweep either way.
Oh, you don't?
I think Alyssa Slotkin can withstand like a 1.5 point Trump win because she has enough of a margin right now, and she's running her own campaign wisely, I might say. Just from a strategy point of view, she's running a separate race, so she is not tied to what happens to Kamala Harris in this state. Mike Rogers, though, because he's behind, literally has to cling to coattails to get across the line.
And has a lot less money.
A lot less money.
All right. So let's go around the congressional. You mentioned the Carl Malinga, John James race. What's happening there?
Yeah, we have the numbers we released last night. We have James leading by 3.8 percentage points. But what's interesting here is you've got just over 5% of the vote is undecided. And when you look at those undecideds, they are breaking disproportionately, like 70% for Democrats in other races. He has work to do to bring those voters home. I think it's going to happen. It's what happened 2 years ago. We saw the same situation where there were a bunch of Democrats who knew nothing about Carl Malinga, and they came home at the end. He brings those home. We're going to have a very similar race to what we had in 2022. It's very close. It's a turnout race. It's a margin of error race. But the onus is all on the Malinga campaign to turn out those voters and bring them in. As I see John James's numbers, they're kind of tapped out. It's as high as he's going to go. So the question is, what does Malinga do down here? Does he close that? And I think he can, but I think it's going to be a real crapshoot at the end.
What about the Dan Kildee seat? That's super competitive.
Yeah, it's very competitive. You got Kristen Rivet McDonald versus Paul Young. Listen, if Kildee is the nominee in that race, it's not a race. That Kildee name is gold up in that in the Tri-Cities area. And you've got two people, you got to remember, Paul Young has run in that seat before. So he started with a lot higher name ID than Kristen Rivet McDonald, who was a state senator, a part of the district. A lot of money getting spent. I do think, though, in the end, that's a race that Rivet McDonald wins very narrowly. But I think it's going to be very close. I think she's got some advantages there. We'll see, but I think she can pull that off there.
And what about the old Alyssa Slotkin seat?
Ooh. Now, this seat, this is Curtis Hertel versus Tom Barrett. Tom Barrett's run there before. He started with a lot of name ID, and Curtis Hertel didn't have name ID. He struggled to build his name ID in that district. Here's the thing you got to remember about that seat. It's a +4 Republican seat. Alyssa Slotkin won that because, whether you like her or not, Alyssa Slotkin is kind of a once-in-a-generation talent in terms of appealing to independents. She knows how to do this in a way that other candidates don't. So I think that's the challenge for Curtis Hertel, is he doesn't have that Alyssa Slotkin independent magic. He's facing, I think, an uphill fight in that district. I think Tom Barrett and J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Mike Rogers have all given him a gift in saying they don't support the Grand River Plant Grant. I think that was just bizarre, frankly, considering that there's 700 families in that district that rely on that plant. But still, this is a Republican seat. This is Tom Barrett's to lose, I think.
Okay. Let's move to the audience. I've been asking all the questions that I want to ask, so let's take hands. We've got microphones. We are streaming this, so don't say anything that you don't want broadcast to the world.
Do you have any insights on the percentage of voters, either state or national, that do split their ballot between parties? Or is it that some people will just vote for a couple candidates and leave the rest blank?
Well, that clearly happens, where people vote at the top of the ticket, and we call it drop-off. Just a huge drop-off when you start getting to, state house candidates, or, my God, the boards. The university boards, it's Supreme Court. There's a lot of people who just skip
Local
it.
judges.
Yeah, local judges. They just skip it. In terms of, do they split? Yeah, absolutely they split. And there's no better indication of that than that CD10 survey we just did, where you have Alyssa Slotkin doing so much better with independent voters specifically than Harris or Marlinga. In that survey, we saw Harris was up with independents in that district by 2 points. Marlinga was up by like 10 or 11, but Slotkin was up by over 30 points amongst independents in that district. So that's the perfect display of ticket splitting that's occurring.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very informative. Given the challenges that we have here in Michigan and the possibility of a mixed outcome on the ballot, do you have any idea of what the other states are doing to push through, as you mentioned, some of those projects despite the disunity? Because what I'm seeing here is a possibility of us wanting to accomplish certain things, and at the same time, a large grouping of the electorate is not seeing the connection of what needs to happen to put those investments in place to retain the talent. What are those other states that you mentioned doing, and what can Michigan take from that to make some progress coming out post-November?
I think that's more of probably a question for you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I would say not all states are doing what some states are doing very well, and Richard mentioned Massachusetts. I would put South Carolina. I would put Tennessee. I'd put Texas and some others in that category. So let me just give you some quick factoids. So in Minnesota, Massachusetts, and Tennessee, they were very concerted efforts that started 20 or more years ago to really focus on education, particularly K through 12. And those were long-term, obviously sustained, mostly bipartisan efforts. Now, obviously in Massachusetts, it was mostly Democratic-led, but they had key Republican support. In Tennessee, just the opposite. It's a Republican state, but they had key Democratic support. And the amount of progress that Tennessee has made in educational achievement, both at the K through 12 level and post-secondary. In fact, a lot of our work at the Chamber has been really modeled after what Tennessee did around, what we call K through 12 plus 2, setting a cultural standard that no matter what zip code you're from, after you finish your 12th grade of education, even after we fix K through 12 education in this state, you have to do 2 years of formalized training afterwards. Get an associate's degree, get your first 2 years of a 4-year university, or get a valuable skilled certificate, right? I mean, it's like pick your own adventure. On economic development, very quickly, I would say that the ability to have a consistent policy year over year, administration over administration, legislative, term over legislative term, is really the recipe for success. And you see South Carolina doing that exceptionally well. You see Texas doing that exceptionally well. The southern states that we used to make fun of, like Mississippi and Alabama, are coming on strong, both from an economic standpoint and an education standpoint.
Let me throw a kind of political swing at this question. We look at other states, and I mentioned, for example, EVs. Mike DeWine in Ohio would never say no to an EV plant or a battery plant. Nobody's telling Tesla workers their jobs aren't good and they shouldn't take them. This is only a conversation that's happening here in Michigan. And we need to ask ourselves, why is this happening in Michigan? And we like to think of Americans like to think of themselves as the center of the universe. Everything revolves around us. I say that jokingly, but we need to take a wider look here at what's happening across the world. And authoritarian governments around the world want to destabilize democracy. And they know the recipe, and that is to divide democratic forces. So as the epicenter of American politics, it shouldn't surprise anybody that we're seeing a lot of outside forces trying to divide us on every issue in the book. And we're falling for it. We are pawns in this game, and we are totally falling for it. And so one thing Michigan can do is realize we got to stop fighting each other and agree on those centralized goals. And you don't see states like South Carolina fighting over this because they're not the epicenter. They're not getting all of this misinformation coming in. We're getting it. So we need to realize we're getting it and pay attention to that.
I'm just going to add one thing about kind of the EV debate here in Michigan. So, I didn't live in Michigan in the 70s and 80s, but, I know enough about what happened here that, it was then not just the people, the citizenry of Michigan, but, the companies, made a real strategic error in ignoring the threat from, Japanese manufacturers, the, emphasis on quality and fuel efficiency, and basically everyone said, oh, no one's going to want to buy these little Japanese tin cans. No one's going to want, these little small cars. And, well, clearly they were wrong, right? And you could say that that was a strategic error made that, Michigan and Michigan's, signature industry never really fully recovered from. And so we're having this debate again. It's actually the same debate. You just swap, China for Japan and electrification, for internal combustion, and it's the exact same debate. And, we get this wrong very much at our peril. And as you said, during your presentation, listen, I don't think any smart analyst is not going to say, oh, we're going to be 100% EV in the next 20 years. No, of course not. But are we going to have 30, 40% in the next 15 years? Certainly globally, absolutely. Do we want to leave that market, on the table? And and someone who spends a lot of time in this space, right? There's nothing magical about the EV business model. Just like ICE engines, you can only make money on volume, right? I mean, if you only sold 4,000 ICE cars a year, you can't sell them at Chevy Equinox prices. You better be selling them at Rolls-Royce prices because you're not making any margin on them at $30,000. So the EV thing is exactly the same. We got to get to volume. So end of soapbox. All right.
Thank you. Great discussion and information. Can you speak to, if you've got any data that speaks to the impact of the vice presidential nomination candidates? Has Vance or Walz made a difference, or has it had an impact on the voting here?
Yeah, I can. So we tested both of their names. We asked, make you more or less likely to vote. Vice presidents don't matter, really. Unless they really damage, nobody's voting on the vice presidential nominee. In terms of Walz, he started the last time we tested his name, he was about 3 points above water. Vance was about 10 points underwater, but Vance had more time to play out. I suspect Walz right now is similar to Vance. They both had their issues in different ways, but neither one is going to affect this race in any meaningful way. And J.D. Vance got a lot of grief early on for the Catwoman comments and all. That was all orchestrated. That was all deliberate. And it's part of this deliberate conversation of ginning up male voters. I mean, that's part of this conversation. We heard the Arnold Palmer comments this week, which frankly, most of us are probably like, oh geez, whatever. But that's a part of a calculation here, to gin up male voters, specifically the base that Trump needs of these rural non-college voters. It plays into their conversations, and they like the joke that he tells. They think it's funny. So that's all part of this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, great conversation. I'm curious about the impact of Citizens United and this divisiveness that you're talking about between basically Democrats and Republicans, but also the independents, and whether that has created the divisiveness, and if there's a chance that it could get overturned probably 20 years from now, and would there be any repair with that?
Well, when you say Citizens United, let's just start with that. If you ask voters how they feel about Citizens United, they'd look at you like you had three heads. They have no idea what it is. No clue. Voters just don't know. What they do know is there's a whole lot of money flooding into politics. That's what they know. But both sides will do this. The other side's doing it. And they're right. The voters are right on that. It is both sides flooding in money from the outside. This is one where, so last cycle, Michigan passed Proposal 1, which was required personal financial disclosure reform, which frankly got watered down by the legislature when they passed it. But Citizens United and the amount of money involved in campaigns right now, just flooding in, we can never wait for legislators or elected officials to do anything about it. If voters have a problem with it, voters are going to have to take it on and tackle it, because the legislation is never going to happen. Neither side has any motivation to dry up the money.
Yeah. And I think the money issue is actually a small part of the divisiveness that you see. I think a lot of the divisiveness and polarization that you see is kind of, you can go back to, the advent of the internet, and cable news. Cable news is a business, not a service. You can look at, how the FCC has changed rules. The reward system for both the media, both small media and big media, and candidates has changed dramatically. And that's why you don't see candidates vying for the middle anymore, because everyone is kind of in their camp, and there's very few voters in the middle anymore. And even the ones that are in the middle have, correct me if I'm wrong, have a relatively, clear voting pattern. Like, yeah, I'm in the middle, but, I generally vote, say, Democrat 65% of the time, right? So
let me talk a minute about
go with that.
the divisiveness and the problem of divisiveness in our politics right now. There was a day, and God, yes, I'm old, I'm admitting this, where we had the fairness doctrine, where if you were going to talk about an issue on Meet the Press, you had to have representatives of both sides talking about that issue. That's how American media worked. You had to represent both sides of the conversation. Voters had to hear both sides. Campaigns used to turn on Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy at the 7 to 8 hour, and you were flooded with everybody's campaign ads. You had to hear both of them. With the advent of the internet and cable news, cable television, we've become segmented into our echo chambers. And let me say, if you want to stop divisiveness and you are watching Fox, CNN, MSNBC, turn them off. That'll help stop the divisiveness. They are not, especially in the evenings, news channels.
Yeah. Anything after 7 o'clock.
They are newstainment channels who have to fill a lot of hours with gibberish. Same with social media. Social media has now thrown us into echo chambers. And I said earlier how we're being influenced by outside forces. Well, there's no better example right now than Twitter. I mean, these are all bots, whether we know it or not. It's just dominating Twitter. And, I'll just say it, Twitter's turned into a sewer. It's not a legitimate place to get information or news anymore. And I think we just have to be very cognizant where we're getting our information, what we deem as real and not real, and stop listening to those things that keep dividing us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just I did a whole hour on this very topic of polarization over the weekend, so it's fresh in my mind. The journalistic standards that people like Richard and I, who are old, grew up with, really don't exist anymore. So if you'd watch Walter Cronkite or Peter Jennings or John Chancellor on the evening news, right? Who watches the evening news anymore? there's a researcher, there's a reporter, there's a copywriter, and there's a whole series of editors, and has to go through that entire process before that piece of news is deemed newsworthy and gets on the air. Now, today, any dude with a microphone is a broadcaster, is a news presenter, right? And, you talk about the gibberish that you see on cable news, on all the cable news channels, right? And you see a panel discussion, right? Panel discussions are great, right? But they're not news. It's 5 people giving their opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
And filling time.
And filling time. All right.
This is the follow-up. May I ask a question for you?
Yeah.
Where do you get your news then?
Oh, we're going to do this. I had this conversation with Andrea. So I have this awful habit of waking up at 4:30 in the morning, no matter what time zone I'm in. And I sit down and I start with, I can go through it every day. I start with the Free Press because of Hugh McDermott, the Detroit News, Lansing State Journal, MLive. So get the Michigan sources. Chicago Trib, Chicago Sun-Times, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. I read a South Florida paper because I spend my winters there. And then you look to the political stuff like Politico. Get it from a lot of places. And don't get it from their editorial pages.
Yeah.
Get it from reported news. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, frankly, has a superb reporting section. I mean, the news they report is really top-notch.
They use that journalistic standard, just
Right.
like the Post, just like the Times.
Separate editorial from the news. It's really important.
So,
In capitalist economies, free enterprise drives the economy. Based on what you see right now, should we be concerned about government's role and impact to, I should say, to free markets? EVs, investments, tariffs, specifically for Michigan. And if we should, then how should we make sure that that free enterprise does not give in to public pressure?
Well, we talked earlier about how business doesn't have a home anymore. And we actually asked the question, do you support a 20% tariff? And what we found was 67% of Michiganders oppose imposing that tariff. They actually think, they agree that it's going to raise their costs. But what's interesting in those numbers is 42% of Trump voters agree it's going to raise their costs, and they're voting for him. And they're the very people most likely to complain about inflation. So I think we need to be really careful in assessing the motivations that voters really care about this stuff. I mean, business people care. This is enormously important to the business community. But the voters, they're not making that assessment that way. I think it would be wise for the business community to really spend a lot of time talking to voters about why it's so important that we have a free enterprise system in this country, a capitalist system. Here in Michigan, we're having this debate right now taking place. State Supreme Court just announced they're going to, that the amend and adopt strategy that the Republican legislature used in 2018 was wrong, and suddenly this ballot proposal that never went to the voters is going to become the law. And the perfect example of this conversation is the tipped worker credit. And what we find is voters are really split, largely, I would say, because the restaurant industry has done, frankly, a masterclass job in this state of having a conversation with voters about what removing the tip credit would mean to their employees. That's the conversations that business communities need to be having. Really direct, person to person, and they need to be using real people to tell the conversation. No offense to CEOs, voters don't want to hear from CEOs. They want to hear, unless it's their employer. They care about what their employer says. But what they want to hear is how it impacts real people. So I think just from a messaging point of view, the business community would be wise to use real people in the community, local small business owners, the people who get tipped worker credits, to have those conversations across the board with everybody. and invest in it constantly.
All right, it's going to be your last question.
Richard, thank you so much for this data. A lot of really provocative insights. This EV conversation is interesting because it's a window into this forward-looking question about what does the economy of the future look like in Michigan, which makes me curious where the generations fall on that question. So what do you see Gen Z's reaction to that question? I define those as folks who are younger than 26. And are there any other insights that stand out to you about the perception of young people and the direction that the state is heading?
So one of the questions we've asked is, would you purchase an EV? Are you interested in purchasing an EV? And the voters are split in this state about even an interest. But there's a huge difference by age. If you are under 40, it shoots up to over 60%, have an interest at least. It's those older voters who have no desire to change in any way, and God knows I'm one of them, and I don't want to have to change if I don't have to. But we have to pay attention, exactly as you're pointing out, to what under 40s think, because they will drive the economy. And so not only on things like EVs, but we have to pay attention to what they think on how they choose to live in a location and why they choose a location. Michigan has a population problem, and we lose quite a few of our young people. And we've done work on that front to try and understand why we're losing population. The reality is nobody wants to talk about it. States that are gaining population dramatically are gaining population because of immigration. You know, immigrants aren't pouring into Michigan the way they are California and Texas. And you may have a real problem with the border and want it solidified, and you may not want this influx of immigrants. But I'm telling you, Michigan's history, if you want to grow the economy, you let immigrants in. Immigrants have built this state.
More likely to start their own businesses. All right, with that, certainly want to thank all of you for spending your valuable time with the Detroit Regional Chamber. Most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Schuba. All right, enjoy your day.